And there's going to be a protest against the change of the mascot at 4. And then at 5, members of the Native community will be there dancing and singing songs. And thanking the Fresno Unified Board. So they are asking for support. It's the last time there were only 5 people that showed up. So I'm going to be making signs and there's got water. And if you would like to join me, it was worth a lot to, well, you know what, to me, because I don't have to be there on myself, but I think it'd be a lot to them too.
Tell us the date again.
Yes, on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, tomorrow, yep, at 5 o'clock at Fresno Neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Let's give her a round of applause. Is our official organization. Woo! So, it's kind of a big deal, you know? Are you serious?
You've
been reinstated. You've been held back for good reasons. Cool. Well, hello everyone. Welcome. Do you need a light on? Are you all? It's really dark. Y'all okay? Okay. If that's nice, that's fine with me. Wow. It's good to see you all. Thanks for being here. This is our second week back from over a year of doing live streams only. So I'm really glad you're here. It's been very life-giving to be back in person with people and to be studying the Bible like not on a screen. So maybe that's just me, but yeah, thank you. Let's pray. Lord, we just recognize your presence with us right now. In the breaking of presence all around us, and we just ask that you would just continue to be with us, and also let tonight be part of one step in a long series of steps of transformation as you draw us closer to yourself, Lord, in community. And we ask this in Jesus' name. I feel like you're so far away from me, but I can't really get closer. So we are continuing our Bible study. We're in Hebrews, like we will be all year. Grandpa was like, I wonder where we're going to be reading from tonight. If you already know, this is 2021. Okay. So, if you have your Bibles, you can pull them out. If you have them on your phone, you do your thing. We are going to be tonight in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 13 to 20. And let's just go ahead and read that. Just to get started, we'll talk about the context and whatnot. So we are starting this, it's the first of the month, by the way. And so we're starting our monthly theme. Our monthly theme is King of Justice and Shalom. I want to shout out Grandpa Dave, who was on the team that helped plan our whole year's monthly themes and kind of breaking down the Hebrews into manageable chunks. So, thanks, Grandpa Dave, for this. And, yeah. So, let me read this to you. It's kind of going off the screen a little bit. Forgive that. But we're going to do that right now, and then we're going to look at before and after the context. So, let's go. Would somebody like to read this, actually? Does anybody have it up? Or do you want to read it off the screen? Hey, go for it. Excellent.
When God gave Abraham his promise, he swore by himself, since he couldn't swear by anyone here. He said, I will certainly bless you and multiply your descendants. So Abraham obtained the promise by showing patience. People pledge by something greater than themselves. The solemn pledge guarantees what they say and shuts down any human. When God wanted to further demonstrate to the heirs of the promise that his purpose doesn't change, he guaranteed it with a solemn pledge. So these are two things that don't change because it's impossible for God to lie. He did this so that we, who have taken refuge in him, can be encouraged to grasp the hope that is lying in front of us. This hope, which is a safe and secure anchor for our whole being, enters the sanctuary behind the curtain. That's where Jesus went in advance and entered for us, since he became a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek.
Yep. Thank you very much. You're like so far away, so that's great. Eyesight. Yeah. So if you recall, we've been saying this all year, right? The book of Hebrews is a sermon. This book is a sermon that's being delivered to a community of people. So this is not just written to one person. This is written to a community. And that particular community has a certain story that is important to understand if you want to get the most out of this book, right? Or I guess I should say this sermon. And that situation is that the community that's receiving this sermon are Hebrew Christians living in the diaspora. So they are Hebrew Christians living outside of their homeland, somewhere in the Greco-Roman world. We don't really know where. Some people think in the city of Rome, but we don't know for sure. But somewhere like that. And they're experiencing really hard times because sporadically on and off they're being persecuted by the community around them and also by, I guess, like the local government. And they are also experiencing, so that's kind of like a pull factor? No, I don't know. That's basically like an outside force. Also, they are experiencing the tension of the fact that because of their faith in Jesus, they're being actively pushed out of their home faith communities, of their synagogue communities, basically. So because of their commitment to Jesus, they're being pushed away from their kind of like communities of upbringing, their ethnic communities of origin, and also like the religious practices that they grew up with, right? But also because of their faith in Jesus, and because they're moving away from Judaism, which was like legally protected under the Roman Empire, into this newer thing. They're also being mistreated by their neighbors, and also occasionally oppressed by the state, So they're kind of stuck in between these really hard situations, and they're looking to ease the pressure one way or another. Some maybe by just kind of like quitting the community, maybe by trying to go back and like get themselves reinstated into their old synagogue communities, or possibly maybe just going under title as a Gentile and just living in the regular Roman world, pretending that they don't have these distinct things at all, So either way, their identity is in like a very precarious place, right? And this is why we saw, the last couple of weeks, we were talking about there's kind of interspersed in this sermon are warnings about falling away, warnings about going back on their commitment to Jesus. And if you know sermons, sermons can be kind of intense. And so 2 weeks ago, I believe it was, we talked about kind of the most controversial, I guess you could say, of the warning passages in the book of Hebrews. And that's the one where it says, it's impossible to restore people to, well, this is my translation, to change hearts and lives, who turn away once they've seen the light and tasted the gift, and become partners of the Holy Spirit, and so on and so forth. It talks about plants bearing thorns and then not being good for the gardener and being cut down and burned. So like very intense imagery, right? But we talked about a little bit about trying to put that in context. This text that we're in here is starting to get kind of the opposite end of that. So they said, warning, if you start to follow Jesus and then you turn back to the community that you were at before, and again, this is like a very particular situation up there, and he's saying like, it's not going to be good for you, right? But now, and then after that, the author says, we're convinced of better things in your case. This is chapter 6, verse 9. We're convinced of better things in your case, brothers and sisters, even though we're talking this way, things that go together with salvation. For God is not unjust, so that he forgets your efforts and the love that you've shown for his name's sake when you serve and continue to serve God's holy people. But we desperately want you to show the same effort and make your hope sure until the end. This is so you won't be lazy, but follow the example of the one who inherited the promise through faith and patience. And then it's going to go on to use Abraham as an example of that in our text here. So that's the text immediately before what we're reading today. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I hope if you did get a chance to listen to 2 weeks ago, where we did talk about that, first about falling away. It is one that has made a lot of people really freaked out, or people interpret it like, oh, if I become a Christian, then I do something bad, or if I take a season away from church, is it true that I'll never be able to come back, or that God kind of has shut the door on me? And we want to say emphatically, no. God's mercy endures forever, right? So, but in the history of the church, that's been a very weaponized text, and we just have to recognize that. I wanted to approach it really carefully because it's really hurt. It's been used to harm a lot of people over the years. And those things deserve care. We want to interpret the Bible in a way that points us to the reality of who God is. And we know who God is from Jesus. So, So this is getting kind of the other end of this is like two truths in tension, right? So the first text, this text that we're reading today is kind of balancing out that stern warning about falling away that we saw in verses 4 through 8. So the author is, like I said, laying out these kind of two truths that are, at least as we experience them, in tension with one another, right? And those two truths are absolute need, the author is saying, you need to respond to God's grace. You need to respond in obedience, and you can't not do that, right? And then that is set in tension with the idea that God can't lie, and what God begins, the work that God begins, will see through to completion, irrespective of our disobedience and our kind of lack of our ability to keep up our end of the covenant. These are two truths that we can't really rationally reconcile. They are in tension, and that's okay. The Bible is full of these kind of things. That's why it's a sacred text. It's meant to draw us deeper into a mystery, not kind of lay out rational, sort of logical syllogisms or whatever, So these two things, right? So the author just finished warning us that the consequences for disobedience are serious. And in this text, it's saying, when God establishes his promise, nothing you can do can revoke what God is going to do, because God is unable to lie. And this is, it's talking about Abraham here, but if you read the entire Hebrew Scriptures, you could read the entire Hebrew Scriptures through that lens of this paradoxical thing, right? God calls a people to be a part of God's project to heal the world because of sin has been let out into the world, right? This is why God calls Abraham. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But at the same time, the people of God are unfaithful. And so there's consequences for them, but also at the same time, God is I'm not giving up on this project. And part of that project is partnering with humans. And so we have these truths in tension, right? Does that make sense? Does anybody need or have any questions? Feel free to raise your hand at the board. Just interrupt me at any point, please. So, like I said, I think we can look at the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures through this idea of the tension between God's irrevocable promise and the need for obedience, and then our, human lack of obedience and promise. Oh, what? I'm making it smaller. We're making it fit. But as we're talking about mystical paradoxes, right? If the text is too big, actually you have to make the screen slightly smaller. Yeah, meditating.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
So then, what about, like God's expectations of us and our accountability and our responsibility? Where does that fit in? Because it's not like, oh, we do everything that doesn't matter. Like, we have to have some accountability.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's a whole half of the tension, right? And so it's like our, over and over in the Bible, it's like, maturity. We just finished a month talking about maturity, right? Maturity comes through obedience. And like without obedience, we will not mature. Without obedience, we're going to miss out on what God is doing. But then we get texts like this where it's like, and even like, not just this text, but the story that this text is talking about, which we're going to get to, is like, God makes a covenant with Abraham and his descendants. And then Abraham and his descendants are just constantly disobedient. And God is just like, this is not working, what's going on? But at the same time, God is recommitting God's to the covenant, right? To the God's end of this relationship. So, like I said, both of them are true at the same time, right? We can't, I don't know if we can square the circle. Go ahead.
I don't know if this is allowed, but it reminds me of something. So like when the way that I always used to hold it, I used to think that that my obedience equaled the promise. So like the two are, it's like connected in the sense of that I somehow was responsible for that. The way that God would love you, the way that He would hold me, the way that all of those things, even the way that I would come to church, I thought my obedience determined those things. And so I don't know if that's part of what you're asking, but I think what it made me think of is lately, what I've been saying to myself, one of my sons, is like, I say to him like, do I love you when you mess everything up? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, do I love you when you're alone? He's like, yeah. So I ask him all these questions, and he always says, yeah, you always love me. And I think that I didn't always know that. And so I feel like maybe some of the question you're asking is like, so what do we have to do for this to be true? And the answer is nothing. Even though it's true that maturity and discipleship and following the Lord and all of these things are a choice for us and a way to enter in and engage, it also does not equal the end of what God does and who He is. So I don't know if that's what you're asking, but that's what made me think about.
The scripture that the equal thing comes to mind for me is like, those who love me will obey me.
Yes.
So then if we love Him, we will obey. So then if we don't obey, does that mean, I mean, like, our love isn't like perfect, but it's just like our obedience reflects our love for God, according to what I read in scripture.
Yeah, and I think that's true. Again, the two truths in tension, I think, is like a hard concept to get, because it's like I think we want to like be able to make the Bible into like a formula where everything kind of fits in place. But it's like it says these two things at the same time, and they do have like, they don't seem to like go together, but you can hold both of them, and they draw you a picture of what God is like, right? That God requires obedience and desires obedience from us because it's for our good, right? And yeah, like our love for God is expressed in obedience, among other things. But at the same time, God's love for us is not like contractually related to our obedience, And God's love, it goes out to everyone. God, what does it say? Like the rain falls on the just and the unjust, right? Okay, we got two. So Fresno, I don't think, yeah.
Okay, kind of piggyback off of what you said about those who love me will obey me. God knows that we're not perfect, and that's why He formulated this present called grace. Because just like children disobey their parents, God knew that He had some hard-headed children. So He made this thing called grace. So when we fall short of doing what we're supposed to do to show that we love God, we are extended the grace of God to where we can come back correct, repentance, and keep going. Just like a parent, you discipline your child, but the discipline ends. They're not punished for the rest of their life. They get their punishment, there's redemption, and you move forward. Is that kind of help?
Yes.
And then at the same time, so in Romans it says like, is God gracious so that we can go on sinning? And it's like, no way. But like, why is that not the case? I don't know. Like, it's just not. I'm not sure. Yeah.
We'll ask them when we get there. So, I think that obedience is not a sign of love, it's a sign of maturity. And I think when He says, they that love me, will follow my commands, that means you have a heart to follow Him. Like, because you love me, you'll want to. You may not do it every time, but you're not going to act up and not care. Like, you're not bothered because you love me, because you want to please me. And like when you have parents or people that take care of you, because I have my parents, you want to do things that make them proud, and you have a heart to do whatever they're telling you to do. You may not do it right all the time, and you may be sneaky and do your own thing, but that's a sign of maturity. That's not necessarily saying that you don't love that person because you don't know them.
Yeah. It's definitely like, I think it's aspirational what Jesus is saying. Like, He's wanting them to say, like express your love to me through obedience. Like, but I think at the same time, we would all recognize that, like, as human beings, we are constrained by a lot of different things, right? So, Paul says, like, oh, I always do the thing that I don't want to do, right? Like, we, in our hearts, like, desire the Lord, but then we are also conditioned by, like, these fears, these anxieties, like, these narratives about, like, what we're capable of, other people's expectations, and all of these things can be overcome through maturity, right? But, like, I think it's another paradox, right, where we can desire to do good but not do, and for a lot of different reasons that the Lord understands, and we shouldn't. I think we should get away from the idea that God acts sort of like contractually in general, where it's like, if I do this, then God will do this. Like, if I am good enough, then God will bless me in this way. Right?
Conditional.
Yeah, conditional.
And I was thinking about the conversation, and I was thinking about my own life, and this idea that somehow, if I do a good thing, or if I'm obedient in this way, that God then is going to do this other good thing, and what you're saying, Pastor Eric. But I think back to what Noel was talking about with regard to the role of grace. I think the older I get, the more sinful I realize I am, and I just am like, it's a little bit, I don't know, just pretty full of myself to think that my one act of obedience is a result of God's blessings. So I'm like, because I know the rest of myself. And I'm like, yeah, that's great, Phil. You did that one good thing. But you got a lot of other stuff in your life that is not obedient, not faithful, So I like the fact that I just feel like, man, the more that I realize that anything that God does is really an act of grace, not a response to my phenomenal obedience, in that moment. I'm just like, I'm very thankful and humbled by His goodness. So I think it's kind of plays in what you're saying. It's just like, this is not about how gracious you are. You just, no offense to anybody, but you're just not that great. Not that either. You know what I mean? So it's just.
And yet you're extremely extremely loved by God.
Oh,
Right?
she's
So-
holy gracious.
Those things go together. All right, next we have Sylvia.
Well, for me, it was like, I know that I had so many, like, when I started to understand the Bible in my life, there's so many things that I know I was disobedient in. So when I heard that word, I was kind of like scared of it. But then with my obedience was to trust God. And that was the only obedience I needed to do, was just to trust Him. And that, God showed me a lot of different, like, that's where I learned grace. And I began to understand God's love. But I think the only way that I began to understand that was to begin to understand who God was and trusting was a way of being obedient to Him. So that was what I think. I don't know if it makes sense, but it didn't seem like it goes together, but it really did. And obedience has changed. Like what the Bible says, how God has shown me, what the world says, because it's like controversy.
Yeah. And these are truths that I think we can grasp better relationally than we can like trying to kind of break these texts down into like if-then statements or like, I don't know. I think a lot of times we are done disservices by Bible teachers, so I want to like speak on behalf of Bible teachers and sorry. Sometimes Bible teachers try to make things like way too simple because they think like if the Bible is scripture, it means it should be clear that anybody can understand it by just reading it. And that's just not true. Like, and that comes from like this idea, people start with a preconception of what they think the Bible is, and then they're like, well, it must act this way. And so then they go to it, and they try to like reduce it down to these really simple formulas. And then I think they just leave people with a lot of questions and going like, well, these things don't seem to make sense, which sometimes they don't, like on the surface, and that's like an invitation to go deeper.
Right.
Because the Bible's not just like instruction manual, basic instructions before it's a sacramental place where we actually meet God. Like, and that's what makes it scripture, not like that it just has like a formula and all you have to do is just like get the code, you know? It's a place where we learn about God, but also by encountering God through the reading of the text. Like that's the difference between it and like just like a good theology book or something, right? Like it's not that it can explain God the most clearly. It's that it's a place that God has intended to dwell as a group, you know? Any more of this? Someone send my hand up? I'm loving this conversation, by the way. Grandpa Dave. What is happening?
Yeah, I kind of think these two, you're talking about truth and tension, I think these sort of match the obsessive compulsive part of my personality, which I've got a bunch, which is that, you know, at first I hear the Lord say, you know, you need to really be taken seriously what I'm asking you to do, what I'm telling you to do, obey, you need to be obedient, all this stuff. So I get on a roll and I start trying to be obedient. And the next thing you know, I'm getting pretentious and hard-hearted, and I'm mad at other people, you know, and just sort of loading on and dumping it on other people. Why can't you be better? You know, I'm struggling so hard. And then what God has to do is remind me, no, wait a minute, you know, I'm the one saving you. It's my grace that's really going to save you. And so then I can get like, oh, good, then I don't have to do anything. I get to way too relaxed. Yeah, but you're really going to get step up here and start doing some of this stuff. And so it's more relational for me than it is like, here's the rule, here's how it fits. You know, I go back and forth on this stuff. And I need both of those voices. I need one day, and I need another one the other. That's how it is for me.
Yes. The Bible's not like the Constitution, where it's like everything has to be in here that like will dictate how everything runs, you know? It's yeah, I don't know, it's relational and it's scripture, it's mystical. So this is like meditation literature. This is something that we're supposed to ponder deeply and look for that relational inner truth. Another skill that we lacked in kind of the scientific age, right? We think about truth in a very scientific type of way, which science is an aspect of truth, right? But there's other ways of approaching truth that don't have anything to do with the scientific method, right? And so, but our mindset has been so colonized by that kind of like certain way of thinking about what truth is. You know, we kind of try to jam the Bible through that. I don't know. I'm mixing my metaphors here. But yeah, we try to put that the Bible into that hole. It just isn't, you know? So yeah. Next time someone tells you, it's really simple. Just be like, yeah. So what this text is talking about is that God makes promises, and because God is who God is unable to lie, and that God can't swear by anything, more trustworthy than God's own self. So God has to swear on God's self. It's like, where else would you go? So here's something just about the swearing and the oaths, the solemn oath. What happens when you swear by God's name? These were all common practices in the ancient world that basically would be kind of like contracts that we think about them when humans would enter into partnerships, do business together, or whatever. So we are used to written documents to ensure agreements, right? If you make business deals with people, right? In the world of early Christianity, however, most business was carried out by verbal agreements in the presence of a witness. That was like that's just how you did things back then. Most people were not literate, and so you couldn't write up a contract. So a person was as good as his or her word if God was called on as a witness. So if you say, you ever heard people say, with God as my witness, like that was a legally binding statement back in the day, because it really meant like if God was called on as a witness, an agreement became absolutely irrevocable. Like that was what you were trying to do. You're saying like you're basically like pushing your agreement level to the max. Yeah. So the writer said that God has made a promise to Abraham and his descendants. The fact that God made the promise is sufficient to ensure its validity and durability. God could not invoke a higher authority than God's self, but to make absolutely certain that the promise is reliable, God took an oath upon God's own self to fulfill it. So God is like, I swear on. So God is saying on God. Just because like you better say that. That has God saying on God.
Make it me.
I didn't have time. I'm sorry. Yeah, so God made sure that there could be no question about the certainty and reliability of God's promise to Abraham. Okay? So what is that promise? What's the promise that God made to Abraham? Anyone? It might be in here.
I will.
Multiply your descendants.
Hey, yes. Oh, where does it say that? 14. There it is. He said, I will certainly bless you and multiply your descendants. So, that is the promise, right? Kind of like seems like a weird thing to be talking about right now. This guy was just like, I'm gonna make you have a really big family. That might seem kind of like parochial or maybe even like I don't know, just like a selfish promise to Abraham, where it's just like, cool, Abraham got this promise. What does that have to do with us, right? But if we understand this, and all the Hebrew readers of this will know absolutely what the author of Hebrews is talking about here. But this is way more than just a promise to give Abraham a really big family, right? On the surface, it looks like it's just kind of a random one. It's like, I'm going to promise you a big family. I'm going to promise you'll have the most trees in Lebanon. But no. This promise is like the foundational promise that God made to humanity as a whole. This promise is like the beginning of God's saving mission to heal the world. like I said earlier. This promise is a promise that's in response to the brokenness of the world, like the sinfulness of humans, the disorder and chaos that we see around us. Like this is the promise that God made in order to move forward God's healing strategy for the world. So, go ahead.
Well,
Yes.
tell us, in you, all.
Hey, I'm trying to build the tension here.
Oh,
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But yeah, so we're talking about the King of Justice and Shalom. Like, this is where the narrative about God bringing about justice and shalom into the world basically gets off the ground. So, we can see it here in Genesis 12, right? So, if you know the story of Genesis, right? There's a garden. God makes everything really great, and then human beings are selfish, and so we mess the world up, and we kind of unleash the opposite of God's goodness into the world. We introduce death and disorder, whereas God made life and order, and harmonious order, which we call shalom. And so God's response to that situation is to basically enter into a relationship with some random guy. So that guy's name is Abram in this story here. So the Lord said to Abram, who's then later Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. And here verse 2 it says, and you can see that it changes it's poetic. That's what being in that weird chunky line verse means. Even though it might not sound poetic, if you read Hebrew, you would know it's poetic. It says, I will make you into a great nation, I will bless you, I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And here's the big part. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And so all the peoples of the earth means like all the families, all the tribes of the earth, every different kind of people will be blessed through my blessing of you, Abraham, and your descendants. So this is basically the beginning of the biblical story of salvation, right? It starts here in Genesis 12. You could argue. I think there's a God saving activity exists before that, because that's the way God is, right? But the plan of like salvation history begins here in the calling of Abraham. Genesis 12, as I said, is a response to the brokenness of creation that God patiently seeks to heal. In Genesis 12, the calling of Abraham and Sarah, his wife, to be a great people, tells of the beginning of God's strategy for healing the world. And in Hebrew, there's a phrase about healing the world that they use called tikkun olam, which just means repairing the world or healing the world. Whoops. That's the best picture I could get. And just think of that in Hebrew. Oh no. Well, anyway. This is like, what's that?
Is it who's Olam?
Yes.
Oh, but it's not.
Oh yeah, I was saying that's a Hebrew word that's translated there into like
I'm saying.
tikkun olam. Well, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. Jessica.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so this phrase means like healing the world or to repair the world. And this is how they would describe not only like what God's purpose in the world is. So this is what the promise is about. It's not just about giving Abraham a big family. It's that through this partnership, God is going to heal the world. We have a question.
I think that's crazy promise though. Like, I'm gonna give you a whole bunch of kids so that you can save the world. Like, was that like for him or was that for God? You know, like, what? Like, sure.
I know, right?
You know, like,
Yeah. It's a weird, like no one would have guessed that that's the way it's going to go down, right? Okay, sounds cool. The writer of Hebrew is going to say this promise culminates in the coming of Jesus.
Right.
Jesus is the descendant that is gonna heal the world. And so even that is kind of a curveball, because we did not expect that. Well, I don't know who knew what, you know? I think I
you, you're the Bible teacher.
Yeah, I love that. Yes. No, I like that image. I'm here for it.
Well.
Trying to get rabbinic here, get a little more dramatic, you know? Yeah. Just,
Yeah, I just love that question though, Sylvia, when you're like, wait, but who's the promise? Like, who is this promise for? Or who's it serving? Is it for Abraham or is it for God? But it's both because it's like about the partnership of repairing the world. I think that's so cool.
so that's the thing, exactly. That's what I was getting at too. You literally get, this is great. So the promise, right? The promise is to Abraham, right? But it's not just for Abraham.
Yeah,
It's through Abraham to everyone.
that's good.
And that's what I wanted to say, like, just kind of as an aside, right? Like, whenever we talk about the promises of God, whenever we talk about, like, our hopes that God has given us, right? Like, we have to recognize that, like, every promise that God gives to us is for us, but it's not just for us. And also, every promise that God gives us is part of this bigger promise. This is the one promise that God made. Like, this is what the text is talking about. When God promises something, like God swears on God's self that it's going to come to pass, right? And every instance of us receiving, like, the promise and the blessing of God is like our entering into this reality, right? So what does it mean for God to heal or repair the world? Like, that's going to look so different in so many different situations. And it's going to be appropriated to each one of us in very unique and personal ways, but they're never just for us. And it's never just about us either, right? The thing that God is doing in us is for us to share with our neighbor, to share with our enemy, and to be a part of this, like, larger story. And that's why it's about partnership too. Like, God can save the world without us, but God refuses to save the world without us, you know? And, like, what does that say about who God is, you know? Allison, are you going to say something?
They're talking about for us, and the blessing is also for everyone. So, like, in my understanding, and I think I've heard this from George Tinker, that so in native theology or spirituality, everything is interconnected. So the blessing being for everyone has to do also with bringing everyone back together by like increasing our capacity to bless each other.
That's so good, yeah. Absolutely, right? So when God made the world, we read in Genesis 1, right, when God declares, everything that I made is very good, you know? It's tov meo. It's very exceedingly good. You know, Hebrew scholars, a lot of them say, you know, we shouldn't take this in a platonic way where, like, every rock was a perfect rock and every tree was a perfect tree, but that everything existed in absolute harmony with everything else, meaning everything existed to bless everything else, right? And in that sense, if that's the case, right, no blessing of anything is just for itself. Like, in that sense, like, every tree exists to bless, you know, the stream near it, that it takes the water into it, and the sunlight that, like, nourishes its leaves, and, like, everything exists to bless and to, like, be good to everything else. And everything lives in love with one another, you know? At least in the way that non-conscious things love one another, right? They can, but just not in the way that I really understand. But that's like the shalom that God is reestablishing through this covenant with Abraham, right? That somehow, through you having a lot of kids, and then I'm going to do something later on through those kids, right? That the connection, that vital love connection between everything that exists will be reestablished. Just the way that I made everything to be, you know? And I love the way that, like, indigenous practitioners of Christian theology, like, really pick up on that, because their worldview, I think, is a lot closer to, like, the ancient worldview. So they see everything as connected. They don't see everything as inert substances or just act on each other through physics, you know? Again, going back to the limitations of our scientific way of thinking everything, you know?
Right, and then, well, and then in that view, so that obedience also is about being restored to the communities, not necessarily something that God is going to punish you if you don't do. But God is working to increase our capacity to be restored to each other and creation.
Yes. I just say amen. Yeah, absolutely. Right, and that's the way that this works, right? We even see it in the text about the blessing, right? Because it's like, I'm gonna bless you, and through that blessing, like untold people are gonna be blessed. The blessing is not just a thing that like goes to a person and then stays with them. By definition, it is like it's flowing and it's moving, and that's the way it was designed to be. And I think that's the way that all God's blessings are designed to be. We're never blessed to hoard it, because then it stops being a blessing. A blessing is only a blessing as long as it's continuing to bless people. And as long as people are hoarding it, they're cutting off, you're walling off like the flow of God's love through you to others. And then you're not obedient and you're not living in harmony and shalom with other people. Like you're actually, that is the act of sin itself, is to try to like hoard the blessings that you feel like God has given you and then keep them for yourselves and not think about your neighbor, right? Like that's classic disobedience in the Bible sense. And so that's just like true about everything.
I just think it's weird that, like, I put myself in everybody's shoes when I read stories from the Bible. I wonder, like, if I was Abraham, if I told me that, what would I think? Or, like, you know, or anybody that God uses in the Bible. I put myself in their shoes and wonder, like, did Abraham really know Jesus couldn't come?
I think the first thing that Abraham thought was, I'm so old, how am I going to have any kids? That's like the first thing that he says, right? Abraham and Sarah are like, I'm insanely old. There's no way. And that's actually where we get the second half of this text, right? When it says that, the second time God makes a solemn oath, and we don't have time to go to this. I had a whole look at this epic slide.
Show us.
Whoa! Things are like real weird. Whoa! I know. This is maybe a teaser for next week, but remember when I was talking about controversial texts that have been used in weird ways, right? Yeah. So the second time that God proclaims that solemn oath to fulfill the promise that God made, it was in the context of the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, right? So Abraham, he's 100, and he's like, how are you going to make a big family for me? I'm all dried up. And so finally it happens, right? And so that's amazing, and that's like demonstration of God's power. But then God is like, hey, why don't you go sacrifice your son to me? And Abraham's like, whoa, speaking of weird paradoxes, right? And I think we're going to go into this more next week, but I think it's important to remember that like this would not have sounded weird to Abraham. He would have been like, what kind of God are you? He would have just been like, yeah, this is what God's asked of us, you know? And so I just want to leave you, before we really get into the story about Abraham and Isaac, because it's integral to this text, so we have to go through it. But the story of Abraham and Isaac is, at its core, the story where God is revealing to Abraham what kind of God that God is. And the assumption at the time, by everyone, was that God sometimes asks you to murder your children for them. And so when God asks Abraham, he's like, oh yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know how I'm going to make this big family when the one son that you gave me, you're now asking me to sacrifice. But okay, it's like if you could make old me have a kid, I guess maybe you could find some other way. But then, the revelation in that story, right, is that God does not require sacrifice. Like, God is not asking us, first of all, obviously, God is not asking us to sacrifice our children or anyone else to God as a human sacrifice. He's doing away with the cultic practice of human sacrifice, but also revealing that, like, I'm not the kind of God that even needs any kind of sacrifice. Like, a contrite heart is what God desires more than sacrifice. And although an animal comes in to substitute for the human, that's even on a trajectory where by the time we get to the prophets are saying, God doesn't really even need animal sacrifice. God doesn't need any kind of sacrifice. God wants our hearts, right? So maybe that's like, I just gave you a spoiler alert. But we're going to have to talk about that next week. And it's interesting. Very, very interesting. But I think sometimes we think that it's just that, like, God is like, I'm going to test you, and I'm willing to, like, kill this baby to get my point across, right? And I think it's actually doing the exact opposite. It's dramatically revealing to Abraham that God is not the kind of God that requires in any way human sacrifice, which was a revelation of God's character at that time, when the going assumption for all gods was that sometimes they just get really thirsty and they need to, like, eat babies, you know? Which sounds ridiculous to us now, right? But that's evidence of our sort of, like, spiritual development, like, historically through the ages, that we think that it's absurd that God would ask us to, like, kill children for him. At the time, it was not the case. So let's be thankful that we are now at a place where we understand what God is like more, and we'll see how we got there next week. So.
You didn't ask to take away because I'm going to share. So, the topic was, like, God of justice and Shalom. And for me, during this time, it's been hard to have hope in the justice around me. But in the beginning, the first slide, you had Hebrews 6. And I'm just going to read it because I pulled it up in the Passion, which took that down because I wanted to read it again. But I'm going to read that. So it says, so it is impossible for God to lie, for we know that his promise and his vow will never change. And now we have run into his heart to hide ourselves in his faithfulness. This is where we find our strength and comfort, for he empowers us to seize what has already been established ahead of time, and unshakable hope, which I need to. We have a certain hope, like a strong, unbreakable anchor, holding our souls to God himself. Our anchor of hope is fastening to the mercy seat in the heavenly realm beyond the sacred threshold, and where Jesus, our forerunner, has gone in before us. He is now and forever a royal priest, like the man that started with him. I can't say it. But for me, it was like reassuring, like, God is providing us an unshakable hope, and he's trying to get our attention. Like, this is a hope that's already been established for you. Like, I put that on myself. Like, I got you. Like, you're going to be okay.
Yes, on God.
Yeah. So that was my takeaway.
Yes, thank you. That's great. Yeah, like I said, I think the author is really trying to give you the other half of the author is like, man, I really freaked you out earlier in that thing where I was telling you not to stop going to church with me. And now he's like, listen, God can take this promise back. God is going to heal the world through the covenant people, and you're a part of that people, whether you like it or not. Like, God is not going to stop until this whole thing is all fixed up and it's real good. So that is a good hope. I really like the way, so this is a common English Bible, which is the one that I have been reading the last few years. I really appreciate. Sometimes it says like a strong, an anchor for the soul. But like a good Bible translator, this team of translators translated it a secure anchor for our whole being. Which, if you know, a couple months ago we talked about what the Bible means when it talks about soul, nefesh. I think like our whole being is like a really great translation for the word soul. And so I just wanted to point that out because I thought it was a really good But like, think about that, like, this is something that we can rest our hopes on. We long for God's justice, right? And we sometimes look out and we don't see it, and we're like, what is God doing? Right? How can we have hope? And we're going to get more into this next week because we don't really get to finish the whole part of this text. So we're going to get to the hopeful part too. We're just like laying the foundation today. So I appreciate you all sticking with me. Does anybody else have like a takeaway that you want? I really like that. Anybody have something that you're going to be reading, pondering, or thinking about? Maybe something that's unfinished too, that's fine.
Well, I've never noticed before that God asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac was, like, now that we're talking about that, like, that was probably like a really common practice. And so, like, it sounds like you're saying that God, instigated that so that God could change the trajectory or like start a new thing too from. I just think it's really interesting how God does that.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. Like, this is what you think is normal. Isn't Scripture.
I think so much of scripture is like starting with what we understand and like meeting us where we're at, which I think God risks being misunderstood sometimes, like so that God can meet us where we are, only to overcome our misconceptions, like with that revelation, right? So, yeah, I don't know, I can think of like 10 different examples of that, but like, yeah, like God is risky. God, out of a desire for relationship with us, will meet us where we are in our like understanding of God, even when our understanding of God is like less than Christ-like, you know? Yeah, I think it's really cool. That's hospitality. Oh, it's 7:36. I'm so sorry. Let me pray for us. Thank you all for being with me. This has been great. I really appreciate like the conversation. I'm glad that you are all like being part of this. That's great. Lord, we thank you for tonight, and thank you for the fact that you are who you are, and that when we make promises, that you are faithful to complete them to the end, that you carry them out to the finish. And we just ask that for each of us, the promises that you've given us, the hopes that you put into our hearts, that we would see the ways in which these things culminate in this big dream that we have to heal the world around us, and to enter into a relationship with us so that we can be part of that healing strategy, that conspiracy, the divine conspiracy, we'll partner with you, Lord. So give us open hearts to see where you're at work, and continue to speak to us about the things that you desire for our lives to take part in that larger story. We love you, and we just I pray that all these people will be blessed this week as they go and do whatever they're going to do, and we know that you are with them, and continue to let your presence with them be known throughout this week. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all. I'm giving you a round of applause for being great learning partners with me, so thank you. I appreciate your comments and discussion. Say what? Oh yeah, whole life meeting is in the cafe. If you want to find another way of partnering with God's mission, that's over there. And then, we're back here in person on Saturday, and we're going to pick up where we left off here next Tuesday. So, lessons.
Kim.